Heat and light. There were no matches to strike, and it was hard to get a fire started, so an effort was made to keep one going all the time, winter and summer. At night the embers were banked with ashes to slow down burning and keep at least a few sparks until morning. Sometimes this failed, and no amount of puffing and fanning would start the blaze again. Then a child would be sent to a neighbor's with a fire scoop to borrow a few hot coals. If there was no neighbor, it was necessary to start a new fire by striking sparks from flint and steel into tinder. Tinder was anything that would ignite easily. The commonest was charred shreds of linen. It was kept with the flint and steel in a metal tinder box that usually had a socket on its top for a candle used to hold the flame once the tinder had caught. To light the tinder, the chunk of flint was held in the left hand over the open tinder box and was struck a glancing blow with the steel so that sparks were thrown downward. The appearance of the slightest glow on the rags was a signal to commence a blowing operation that might succeed in nursing the spark into a small flame. Charles Dickens, who had made a fire that way, said that with luck it could be done in half an hour. That would be a long half an hour on a January morning with the fire out. Once flame had been kindled, it was quickly transferred to the tinderbox candle or to a sliver of pitch pine and applied to a handful of shavings or splinters to start the fire. Starting a fire with paper would have been unthinkable. Paper was far too valuable. Fire scoop, tinder box, and flint and steel in use. The inset is an enlargement of the steel. Up to the 18th century, no improvement had been made in artificial lighting for 3,000 years or more. The lighting used at Plymouth and Boston was not more primitive than what had been used then in London and Paris. In fact, the settlers were better off, for they had unlimited wood for bright fires, and they had the American pitch pine that would blaze brightly if somewhat smokily from its own resin. A torch of this light wood or candle wood could be lit and stuck between two flagstones on the hearth, and most of the smoke would go up the chimney. This means of lighting was generally called a candle set. Aside from the pine torches, all light was obtained by burning fat or wax in some way. The commonest way was the rushlight, which was made by soaking the pitch of a dried rush in grease. When it was saturated, it was pinched in the jaws of a special holder, and its projecting end was lighted. It not only smoked, it stank. It needed constant attention because as soon as it burned back to the jaws of the holder, it went out. The holders were made in many forms, with hooks to hang on the edge of a shelf, with spikes to be driven into a beam, with bases to sit on a table, and with legs to stand on the floor. Most of them were iron, and sometimes the weighted end, which kept the jaws closed, had a candle socket on it, a rushlight, a tall candle holder, and a portable candlestick. Grease was also burned in the so-called Betty lamps, as it had been before Athens was founded. The name seems to come from the early English word beddings, meaning oil or fat. Basically, this kind of lamp was a shallow grease-filled metal dish with a lip in which lay a linen wick burning just beyond the lip. It was better than the rushlight because the wick absorbed new grease as it burned and so needed less care. A Betty lamp ordinarily had a handle that curved inward over the grease dish and had attached to its end a chain terminating in a combination spike and hook for hanging the lamp. An adjustable hanging candle holder. On the same chain was hung a sharp pick about 2 inches long for pulling the wick out to make it burn brighter. Any kind of grease was burned. Much use was made of beer fat, deer fat, fish oil, and even passenger pigeon fat, and our forebears complained of the smell of all of them. When domestic animals became plentiful, their fat was used, but it didn't smell any better. People worked and even read by the light of these things, though it's hard to see how they did it. There were few candles at first because of the lack of material to make them. When the sheep population increased enough to provide tallow, candles became more plentiful, but they were sparingly used. It was found that really good candles could be made from the wax of bayberries. These were the grayish-white fruit of a low bush which grew and still grows everywhere along the Atlantic coast. The sage-green candles were of such quality that in time they were exported and were welcomed in Europe, not only because they gave a good clean light, but also because they smelled good when they were extinguished. Anything which gave light and smelled good, too, was a novelty. People liked to scent a room by extinguishing the candles for a few minutes before company was expected. Most candles, especially at first, were made by dipping. Depending on the size of the wax pot, 6 or 8 wick strings were hung a couple of inches apart on sticks called candle rods. The wicks were laid across the stick at their middles, and the 2 parts were twisted together below it. This gave a desirable thicker wick and produced the bottom loop that was characteristic of all colonial candles. A Betty lamp for burning grease. The wax was melted and the wicks were repeatedly dipped in the pot a rodful at a time. After each dipping, they were set aside to cool, the ends of the rods resting on parallel poles set up for the purpose. Experience was needed to keep the pot at the right temperature. If it was too cool, the candle came out lumpy. If it was too hot, it would melt off the wax already deposited. On a cool day, a good dipper could make a couple of 100 candles. After life became settled enough for artisans to set up shop, it was possible to buy metal candle molds that made candle making much simpler, but they didn't eliminate the dipping process. These molds were tapered tubes made of sheet iron called tin or, more rarely, of pewter. They were made in connected groups from 2 to 2 dozen. In any group, the upper ends of the molds, which would make the bottoms of the finished candles, all opened into a shallow pan into which wax was poured. The bottoms of the tubes were closed except for a hole in each just big enough for a wick. Wicks were threaded through the holes and were looped over small sticks that laid across the pan at the top of the mold. The whole mold was filled with hot wax and set aside to cool. In cooling, the wax shrank enough for the finished candles to be pulled out. Candle dipping and its product. Candle molding and a finished molded candle. After a while, it became customary for traveling candle makers or chandlers to bring their own large molds to a house and make up the family's accumulated stock of tallow and wax into candles. They were seldom given any actual money for the job. They took country pay in the form of extra wax or almost any other product of the household that both parties could agree upon. Benjamin Franklin's father was a candle maker, a tallow and wax chandler. Home crafts. For a long time, Northerners who needed any article had to make it for themselves. It was possible to import things from England if you had money or credit, but few had either. In the South, the export of tobacco established credit for England, and the planters did import much of what they needed. But the North had no great export at first, and by the time trade got going, the people had acquired the habit of supplying their own needs. All grease was saved. It was not only valuable for lighting, it was also the basis of soap. Wood ashes were saved too. They supplied soap's other ingredient, lye. The ashes were thrown into a barrel between layers of straw. A little water was poured in now and then, and lye dripped out of a seep hole at the bottom of the barrel. The straw kept the coarser part of the ashes from clogging the hole. To the accompaniment of a ghastly odor, grease and lye were boiled together in big iron kettles out in the open air. Boiling soap. Door latch of wood. Wooden hinge. The mess was constantly stirred and it cooked into a harsh, soft soap. For some reason, the operation wasn't always successful, and it was hence a courtesy to wish a neighbor luck with her soap. To promote the luck, the soap was always stirred in one direction only. Soft soap could be hardened by an addition of salt, but not much salt was wasted that way. Iron was sparingly used even in Europe during the 17th century. In the colonies, though early attempts were made to start ironworks, not much of it was to be had at any price. What there was used for cooking pots and tools, where no other material could be substituted. The settlers and their descendants for years had to find ways of making wood to do the work of iron. Door hinges and latches were made of tough wood. We still make wooden barrels, but those intended for liquids have iron hoops. Colonial barrel hoops were made of hickory and ash. Buckets were made of wooden staves and looked like small tubs. 2 staves on opposite sides were left longer than the rest and were pierced near their tops to serve as handles. Bales were put on iron cooking pots, but a bucket of water was carried by a stick put through the holes in the long staves or by a short rope tied from hole to hole. Pagans, which were smaller than buckets, were made the same way, except that they had only one long stave, sometimes pierced, but more often shaped into a handle to be grasped. All of these things, barrels, pails, and pagans, were made by professional coopers, who were possibly the first artisans to ply a trade in America. Even so, there weren't many coopers, and in most houses, homemade substitutes for their work had to be made by laboriously hollowing out logs. Even big barrels for the storage of salted meat were excavated from tree trunks 3 feet across. The Indians used fire to help in clearing out the insides of their log boats, and no doubt the colonists copied the method. It involved constant fanning or blowing. Since much carrying of water was done daily, every family whittled out nicely fitting human neck yokes that reduced the arm strain of carrying 2 buckets at once. In the illustration of the Puritan huts on page 24, there is a man using a neck yoke. The heavy yoke that coupled a span of oxen and by which they pulled a cart was made entirely of wood. So probably was the cart they pulled. 2 centuries later, Western pioneers built the Red River cart without an ounce of iron in it anywhere, because they had no iron to put it in. There is very early mention of a wheelwright being brought to New England, but nothing is known of this product, except what can be guessed from English ox carts of the time. It's even possible that he didn't build vehicles at all, but made spinning wheels. The term wheelwright covered both crafts. The list of colonial wooden articles is long. Even spades were carved, handle and blade, together from a single wooden billet, though it's safe to say that such a one was never used in preference to an iron spade. The wooden hay fork may have had some advantage over a metal fork, if only in the way of lightness. There's a drawing of one of them in the section on New Netherland. A hollow log barrel. A barrel, a piggin, a churn, and a bucket. Wooden spade. In addition to their wooden trenchers, noggins, and spoons, the settlers made bowls of the knobs, called burls. They grew on some maple trees. They learned the trick from the Indians. The natural shape of a burl is like the bottom of a bowl, so it only had to be cleaned up and hollowed out. Only. Burl grain runs crazily in all directions, so a bowl made from one didn't readily split. Cloth. The new Americans had to provide clothes for themselves. Cloth and made-up garments could be imported from England, and in the South they usually were, but again the North lacked the money for that. There was also the chilling fear of importing the plague along with the clothes, which, if one happened to bring in the right flea, tucked into the seam of a doublet, would have been entirely possible. On the other hand, it would never have occurred to anyone then to refrain from wearing a garment merely because it had a few fleas in it. Producing one's own clothes meant not merely tailoring them, it also meant weaving the cloth to be tailored, and spinning the yarn to be woven, and raising and preparing the material to be spun. Linen was first, because flax can be sown in May and harvested at the end of June. Wool takes a full year to grow on the animal, and it takes some years to develop a flock of sheep by breeding. So flax was grown in 1640, and though it is estimated there were 3,000 sheep in New England in 1644, their wool wasn't enough to clothe the population.